Okay, I mentioned to you last week that we had three elements of English 1302, three basic parts or things that you learn about in English 1302, which are argument, research, documentation, and hopefully I can get the door closed. One of the things I hope you can see, at least through some of the reading that you've done and work that you've done this semester, is how the three are kind of connected. They are a little bit tougher, harder for some things, but as you might imagine, if you're writing an argument, you may want to have information in order to write that argument, right? So that's got to help you with that. And if you are going to get information from someplace other than your personal experience or what is common knowledge, then you have to document that material. So that supports this. Later on, and to some degree I've already said this, but later on when we talk about the works cited page, I will also make the argument that documentation also helps you to support your argument. You document well, you document consistently, you document properly, and that helps your argument considerably. At least it helps your ethical appeal, which is something we're going to talk about here in a few minutes. I apologize that today is I guess you could call it a lecture day. It's the day where I get to do most of the talking, but we'll see what happens. Today I'm going to give you a very brief discussion, explanation of both argument and research. As you remember, we've talked about the in-text portion of documentation, which you practiced on the paper you recently turned in. And we're going to use certainly the works cited page portion of documentation on the papers you do for the remainder of the semester. So we're not going to talk about those today. But we are going to talk about argument and research and kind of how they go together. And what I want to do also is to dispel some myths, some false ideas about how both of these things work and why they're important. Okay? And I want to start first with argument and talk about that. If I were to ask you today to write about a recent argument that you were engaged in, I would guess that the majority of you would say, that my last argument was with a family member, a close friend, a spouse, a sibling, something like that. Because those are, for some reason, as you might imagine, the most important arguments to us. We tend to love people somewhat unconditionally, right? But we end up having the most vociferous, loudest, angriest arguments with the people that we have a vested interest in getting along with. And so those become important. If I ask you to tell me about an argument you recently witnessed, but were not engaged in, the majority of you would probably talk about something you saw on television. Maybe a talk show. Or maybe two friends that were arguing over something that you didn't care about. Okay? And one of the reasons I raised that issue is because what's important to you as a student, as a student writer, is that you have to get away from the idea that argument is always about fighting. It's always about competing with people. There are some people who, for example, love to argue. You know those people? They don't care what the topic is. It could be the silliest, dumbest topic on the planet, and they will argue as if the fate of the free world hangs in the balance, right? And so those people see it as a competition. And I hate to tell you, but guys are worse at this than women. Guys tend to do this. We got this I got to win mentality. And so they tend to get that kind of thing going. Sometimes that's good because it forces us to think. Argument oftentimes helps us to think more critically, but sometimes that's obviously bad because we tend to piss off people for over something that's really not terribly important. Okay? So that can be a problem. On the other hand, we have lots of people who hate arguing, and they will run from an argument any time that there is one available to have, even when that argument is a very important one. And a lot of arguments are. And think about this for a sec, that argument itself is not always a fight. It can be essentially a question that I've got to answer and I've got to figure out. If you go to the store and you buy something, or you need to buy something, in a way you could have an argument with yourself as to what you're going to buy. If it's a particular food, unless you are brand loyal and there's a particular thing you have to buy every time, and you won't take any other thing, which is my wife concerning various grocery items. I can bring home the store brand of some things, but some things I have to bring home this specific brand. And if I don't do that, I will be going back to the store. But if you're, say, buying a car, and you have to weigh a lot of options, and you are the one making the decision, it's your money that you're spending, of course, then you will have an argument, as it were, with yourself. Well, this one costs a little less, but the insurance will cost me more. This one is newer, but I've read in Consumer Reports that it breaks down more often. You have all sorts of things that you have to weigh when you make such decisions. Okay, so if you think about argument in those kinds of terms, that you're just coming up with decisions, sometimes which you have to have, and sometimes which could be things that you can bend a little bit on, then it gets away from it. Okay, we have to get away from those things. What we also want to avoid is the my way or their way thinking, okay? Sorry. If you think in those terms, you get yourself in a lot of trouble because you don't solve anything, okay? Think about, for example, things that people post on Facebook. We do this all the time. We may do it, so other friends may do it, and they do things like they'll post some kind of odd fact that they think is a fact or might be a fact or is kind of a fact but taken out of context. And then right at the bottom of it, they'll say, click like if you agree. Share if you agree. And I see those things a lot of times and I go, well, it might be more complex than that. There might be a little bit more to it than that. And we have to think about that. Now, so before we can look at the parts, we have to think of some things that are, I sometimes see them as what's behind the argument. And another way to look at it is what drives our argument, okay? There's a lot that's there that we don't always acknowledge when we have an argument or when we write an argument. Now, keep in mind that I'm trying to get you to thinking in terms of academic arguments, which are not the same. They're not the same as the fights over various things on Facebook, the things that you have great passion for, okay? And one of the reasons I tell students oftentimes, or I don't allow students oftentimes rather, to talk about things that to write about things that they have this deep emotional attachment to, is that they have a deep emotional attachment, so much so that they can't see what's behind. Okay, they can't see what else is going on in the picture. They can't see what else is part of that argument. Okay? For example, you may have a very deep feeling about abortion, whether it should be legal or not legal. You may have a very strong opinion about various political candidates or people who are in political office. You may feel strongly about the way weapons should or should not be regulated. And unfortunately, when even some of my very best students write about those topics, they write poorly. They write bad arguments. And when I say they write bad arguments, they don't write bad arguments because they're wrong. They write bad arguments because they can't see all the things that are right. And they can't see anything but their own ideas. To get to good argument, you're going to have to look at some other things. So, let me start with who. Okay? That little guy there in the middle, that's my son. That's when he was 5 or so. He's not as cute as that anymore. He used to be very adorable. Now he's 17, has a little goatee, slumps around. But then he was cute. You can see the smile. That was a great time because he thought I was a cool guy then. Now, when he was this age, I had an argument with him almost every day. Now, children that are 5, particularly boys, tend to idolize their fathers. They tend to see their fathers as these really great people until there's a conflict over the television. So I would say to my son, Max, it's time to take a bath. And my son would not wish to take a bath. Now, I don't know if you've ever spoken to a 5-year-old boy, but 5-year-old boys don't have the cognitive development to understand reasoning the way adults do. So I can't sit down with him and say, it's not a good idea to not take a bath and give him all these tips on good hygiene. Now, when he turned 13, 14, I could do that because I could say simply, girls don't like guys who smell bad. And that was usually enough to get him to think, maybe I should take a shower today. But when he was 5, he wanted to watch TV. So it was very hard for him to get away from that idea, right? So the who in this argument, of course, is myself, and it's also my son, right? But it's not just that these are two people with two opposing positions. My son doesn't hate baths. He likes playing in the tub, or he did then. I don't know what he does in there now, and thank you, I don't want to know. But at the time, once he got in the tub, started playing with his toys, he was having a good time and he would forget the television. But before I could get him in there, I had to, shall we say, negotiate, persuade. And I always won this argument. Anyone want to guess why?
Because they would tell him, like, you stay here maybe, or what?
That sounds like reasoning.
Or maybe what he wants.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Shadrach. Let me let you finish. I did try to reason with him, but that didn't work.
Maybe tell him, hey, if you take shower,
Offer like a reward, maybe?
Yeah.
Well, and sometimes I could remind him that, you get to play with this toy, and then he'd go, oh yeah, I get to play with this toy. And he'd forget about the TV. So you're right about that. What had you said, Beth?
Just like pick him up.
Right. That's the biggest reason, because I was bigger than him. And I could pick him up and put him down and hold him in the water till he stopped moving or breathing or whatever. Right? So I would always win, but that's not an argument. That's power. That's me having more power than him. At the age of 17, he may have more physical strength than I have. Right? So if he's not taking a bath, physically picking him up and putting him in the bath would require me to break one or more of his limbs, which apparently, according to the state, is abuse of some sort. Okay, now I don't actually have to have that problem. But if my son had severe depression, his reasons for not taking a bath, the person behind that would be very different, right? When he's 5, the reason he doesn't want to take a bath is because he wants to watch TV, and he can't get away from the idea that other fun stuff exists, because that's about cognitive development. If he is an adult or near adult and he won't take baths on a fairly regular basis, there may be something behind it, right? Now, that's not true of my son. He has no problem taking baths because apparently he does like girls and he does not like to smell bad when he's around them, which I'm very happy to have. But there's more to it. Let me bring another kind of argument that we talk about in families. This happens a lot. When we have a curfew, okay? You remember curfews? Some of y'all have had curfews. Who's involved in the curfew? Parents and who?
The child.
And the child. And I'm going to put child in a sense in quote marks because that's a different argument all the time, right? Could we agree, for example, that a curfew, whether you're a parent or plan to be a parent or not, could we agree that a curfew for a 12-year-old should be different from a 17-year-old?
Yes.
Why?
Because one is young and one is old.
Old?
I mean,
I'm going to give my boy my
maturity,
cane when I
I
get home.
guess. It's like a maturity thing. Like
You're right. I
one
agree
has
with
a
you.
better idea of right and wrong, and one, you know what I mean?
That's good. That's excellent. Very good. What else?
Um,
What else about 17-year-olds that are different from 12-year-olds?
I think it's like for the younger one is actually more like for their protection.
Yes?
And the older one is more like I mean they actually they have that sense of knowing that okay this is where I need to be home, like this is the time when I need to be home.
Okay.
So and like the younger one won't have they'll be playing and maybe they might
Right.
forget,
Yes.
So that's
Very good. A 12-year-old is much more likely to lose track of time than a 17-year-old, sure. You can even add to that, speaking of maturity, a 12-year-old generally doesn't have the cognitive development necessarily to understand that his actions could cause him harm. Now, a parent may do something for protection in both cases, but a 17-year-old may understand, at least on an intellectual level, that if you are in a certain place or with certain people or you find yourself in certain circumstances, a 17-year-old may have the cognitive understanding that, okay, if I stay here, this is my choice, and I might get in trouble. A 12-year-old's going, hey, this is fun. Okay? Any other reasons given to me by someone other than Beth and Shay? Yes, ma'am.
Responsibility.
What kind of responsibility?
Like, let's say, if the car was to be in those circumstances,
Okay, good. A 17-year-old's more likely to be driving, right? So they've already had they've had, at least in a legal sense, to prove that they are responsible people, even though they're not necessarily fully human. I hate to tell you that. I've been around teenagers too long. They're not fully human. They're almost there, but they're almost there. But you're right. They have different responsibilities. They could have a car. They could have a job, right? So if I want my children in my house by a certain time as a 12-year-old, that child doesn't usually have a job. It's going to keep him or her out. Whereas a 17-year-old might have a job. They may be saving up for a car or saving up for college, or they may be helping the family. I've had many students who are at 16, 17 years old, they're working and going to school, and they're trying to help the family along. They're helping to pay the bills, get the groceries, those sorts of things. Well, it's kind of hard to tell someone who is contributing to the family's finances, you got to be in at 9 o'clock, because then they have to tell their employer that, and then they don't get so many hours. Right? So we've got essentially the parents and the child. But there's more to it than that. Let's say we're now dealing with someone who's closer to 19. Legally, they're like half an adult. There are certain things they can do as an adult that only adults can do, but there are other things they can't do as an adult. They can go fight for the country, but they can't necessarily drink alcohol, in theory. I'm not going to talk about the realities. Okay? So there's all those same factors are different even for between 17 and 19. But you also have different things that are involved, right? The child might be an only child. The child might be a child in a big family. I'm an oldest child. So imagine that other people get involved in these arguments. You've ever gotten involved in someone else's argument? Because you have a vested interest in the outcome. I always thought it was funny when my kids, particularly my oldest, was growing up, and some other teenager would come over and explain to me why I should change my rules about curfews. God bless them. You know, you should really let her stay out later because that's not cool if you don't. That never went over very well. But when I was growing up and talking to my dad, and my dad and I had many arguments. You know, this never sat down. This was never a negotiation. We sign a contract, right? That never happens, and that gets to our how, right? When I argue with my dad, my brother John always sided with me. Always sided with me. He was 1 year younger than me. Now, why do you think he was always on my side?
It was for his benefit.
Explain how. You're right.
With curfew, he could stay up longer.
Mm-hmm. He was no dummy. He knew that if I got to stay out longer, he'd get to stay out longer. You're absolutely right. Now, I have a sister, Jennifer, who's 7 years younger than me. So that when I was a teenager, my sister was a smaller child, and that was back before she realized the truth, that I was not a very cool guy, that I was not a very nice person or a very interesting person. She liked having me around. So she would always take my parents' side. Same reason, right? Because she figures that if the later I'm out, the more I'm not home to play with her, to hang out with her, watch TV with her, do whatever it is that I did. Now, that's neither bad nor good, it just is. But if you think about it, when you look at an argument, whether it's something tiny, like between you and a significant other, which is never tiny, or say a big political, moral, ethical issue, sometimes you have to look at all the people who are going to be directly affected by whatever the outcome is. Now, how does this argument take place? When you argue over a curfew, when you argue over a curfew, did you always, I know some of you had this argument, you always sat down with your parents once a year at the table, you negotiated quietly and calmly, you listened very carefully to what your parents said, right? And you very calmly, coolly came up with your ideas, and they listened very carefully to you, right? Is that how it happened? No. No? Who said no? I heard you. Why is it not no? Why is it no? You're absolutely right.
Because parents are always gonna be saying that, well, they're the ones like, oh, you're my kid, you get to listen to me, and then the kid's always gonna argue about how they're right and how they want to do things. And
Okay. Do you think that partially is because the two sides can only see their position?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure. And that oftentimes is the truth. Not only, of course, what usually happens, and I've watched a lot of these things over the years, is that what oftentimes happens is I'll listen to one side and the parents will say, that kid just doesn't understand where I'm coming from. And the kid says, these parents have no idea what I'm thinking. They don't think the other one knows anything. They only see their own position. And of course, because you feel strongly about it, you can't see why it's wrong or why there could be a possible compromise, which I have found hilarious. And by hilarious, I sometimes mean tragic, because sometimes it is tragic. And almost every family has had, if not an argument over curfews, they have arguments over similar types of rules, right? So, but how an argument takes place makes a big difference in how effective it is, and also how that argument is received. I tell students all the time, I said this, remember at the beginning of the semester, I said, if you email me, never click send when you're angry, right? Because that's a bad idea, and it's a bad idea anytime, whether you're emailing your professor or emailing a friend or shooting something on Facebook, if you are one of those who gets sucked into those Facebook arguments, which oftentimes have tragic endings, okay? It's never a good idea to hit send when you are angry. And it's pretty simple. Even if you feel this way, you may do more harm than good, right? Consider, for example, that you don't have your own car, you rely on your parents for the car, right? And so you expect the parents to give you the car on the weekend. So you go to Dad and you say, Dad, I have a date this weekend, I need the car. Or I want to go out with my friends, I need to borrow the car. And Dad says no. And your response is, well, Dad, you sorry sack of blankety blank blank blank. Is Dad's response very likely to be, oh, now that you've determined that I am a blankety blank blank, here are the keys. That's terribly persuasive, right? Insulting the person who has the power to give or not give is not always a very good persuasive idea, right? And yet we do this all the time in argument. A lot of times when people write, and I'm not just saying students, I see it every day. People write about things they have very strong feelings about. They don't look at the who, they don't look at the why, they don't look at anything else but what they feel. And because they can only rely on their feelings to explain what they're trying to do, they don't always do what's effective. In my English 1302 class, we have an ongoing discussion that I informally call Why I Lose Arguments with My Parents When I'm Right. And all through the semester, we use different things that go wrong in arguments that we may feel right about, and we say, we're going to lose, we're not going to get what we want, even if we're right, because of this. And so, how we approach it may make a difference. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people behind are always rational. Because I don't know if you've ever been either a parent or a young person, but sometimes we're not rational. We always think we're rational, but we think other people that disagree with us are not. Doesn't work. So how we do it makes a big difference. If you use loaded language, if you handle things in a particular way, I'm going to talk about how we appeal to our audience in just a minute. That changes the focus and changes the way in which your reader, your audience, receives what you have to say. Now, why do you think that two people, the parents and the child, which is not always a child, but actually an adult sometimes, why is it that they're having this argument in the first place?
Disagreement.
Well, that's what an argument is, right? The disagreement. But why are they disagreeing?
Because there's a difference in thought.
Yes. What is the difference? Let's put it a different way.
I don't
I'm
want to
sorry?
say.
You know?
I don't want to say like opinion, but
There is a lot to doing with the perspective, but okay, let me put it a different way. If our two parties are parent and young person, right? What does the young person hope to get out of the argument? What do they want?
Permission,
They want permission to
do what they want,
be more specific. We're talking about a curfew.
or go out.
They want to go out and they want to stay out later. You know, if the parents say your curfew is midnight and you want to be out later than midnight, then your reason for having this argument ostensibly on the surface is I want to be out later because being with my friends is more fun than being with my family. And that's the way most teenagers feel. That's not bad. That's just the way things are, right? So if you'd rather be with your friends and you'd rather spend more time with your friends or your significant other or somebody else, which is natural for people to feel, that is your purpose. That is why you're having this fight. Because if it was something you didn't care about, you wouldn't yell at your parents. Remember the how. People say things in that argument that are absolutely goofy. Goofy.
Um, so what if, okay, it's not nothing to do with your family. Like you want to spend like with your friend that you haven't seen for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I mean that could cause an argument as well. I mean, you know, we can a child or young adult can be haven't seen this person for a long time, so on, and spend
So that changes the reason why. Absolutely, very good. So they may feel that their circumstances are special. And that's a really good point to make, I really believe, because one of the things that I always found funny with my oldest daughter was that every weekend there was something special. This party is the most important party of the year. And of course, in a month, the most important party of the year will also happen. Completely different, important party. Or this date is really, really important. Or these friends are really, really important. So that oftentimes I could not tell the difference between what was truly important and something that wasn't. And you're absolutely right. I've been picking on my daughter. One of the things that she did that was really, really smart was when she had her prom, she actually thought, you know what? I'm not getting anywhere calling my dad names, so I'm going to sit down and talk to him. And I'm going to say, I know this is what you care about, but this is really a special occasion. And you don't have to convince me that prom is more special than just going out with a couple of friends, right? I hope it is for most people, right? Very good point. So she sat down and said, well, my curfew is this time, but I would like to be out later because, not just because it's special, but because in order to make this a special occasion, we're going to have to do this, this, and this. She also anticipated my argument, which was really smart of her. Because I'm going to come back to my why. Why is the parent interested in this? The parent, why is the parent making this rule and being so vociferous in the argument? Is it because we're mean and terrible and we want to make you miserable?
Because they've gone through it already.
They've gone through it already. Very good.
They want to protect their own child.
They want to protect their child. Very good.
Sometimes it's just I think they want to know. I mean, like what you're gonna be doing. Because if there isn't a coffee on the house or whatever, then you won't be you won't know. A parent won't know what the child is doing. Because.
Yeah, if you don't know the friends or you don't know the circumstances, it's kind of new, then it's hard to be trustful. Even if you trust your own child, even if your child has proven herself or himself to be a very responsible person and is willing to do all the right things, doesn't usually get themselves in bad situations, even then you are concerned. So the parent on the surface has this reason for, I want to protect you. So I bring back to what my daughter had done when she was asking about her prom. She said, I know you're concerned for my safety. And this is the first time I had a child with a phone. So she promised to call me, let me know where she was and how things were going at particular intervals. I didn't have to call her. I didn't have to check up on her. I let her prove herself trustworthy, right? And so it was easy for me to say, okay, I'll know you're still alive if every couple of hours you give me a call, right? So that helped me feel better about this new situation. She also had said, well, I'm also going with these friends that I already knew and I already trusted, as opposed to other friends of hers that I did not like and did not trust, right? So I could also feel more comfortable. So she appealed to my why. Why am I fighting this so vociferously? And that was very wise. She used a tone of voice that was not, I'll do anything you want, Dad, but firm, but also reasonable. Like, I want to listen to you and I care about what you think too, but this is how I feel and this is what I think I can do. And it wasn't just based on feelings, right? So it made it a lot easier for her to persuade me to make exceptions to the rules. So this argument doesn't have to turn into horrible things where counselors and police and ministers have to get involved. Although sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. I've argued for a few years that there's another bigger reason this argument has to take place. Families have to have arguments like curfew arguments on a bigger picture. Because, as we already established, you're not the same person at 17 that you are at 12. You're not the same person at 19 that you are at 17. Even though you may be dependent on your parents for some things, you are not dependent on your parents for other things. When you are 4 and 5 years old, your parents can choose your friends for you. When you are 19, they cannot. Not unless they lock you in a closet, right? You are already becoming an independent person. We don't have like a cutoff where suddenly you turn 18 and you are suddenly independent. Suddenly you have no things attached to your family. Now some of us would like that, but it doesn't work that way. It usually works slowly. Even after you move out of your parents' house, you're still connected to them in some ways. You may not follow their rules, but you're still connected to your family in an emotional way, or some ways, okay? So I would say that for the young person, this argument has to take place because it's part of how we grow as families. We negotiate, right? And guess what I've learned now that I've got most of my kids grown and out of the house? Thank you, Jesus. Almost got them out. I've learned that when our children go away, they don't stop arguing with people. An argument is not necessarily a bad thing. If you have a relationship with someone and you've never ever argued, it's either brand spanking new or you're dysfunctional. You have to, because you're going to live with another human being. Who do we fight with the most when we get to be adults?
Yourself.
Right. Our spouse. The person we have a vested interest in demonstrating love for every single day. And those are the biggest arguments we're going to have. So if we don't learn how to do that with somebody we love, we're going to have a hard time doing that when we get older. It's also part of the way in which parents can slowly, by degrees, allow that independence to happen. That's hard for parents. If you just cut things off, it's not easy for most parents to do that. And of course, we have goals. Our goal may be, I want to demonstrate independence. I want my child to be independent, but I want my child to also understand they live in a society of rules. There may be more things to it than that. Now, let's look at some of the parts of an argument. That is, things that are basic elements of an argument are the issue, the thesis, and support. The issue is not our topic, but it is the question we need to ask, that we need answered about our topic. What do we need to know? What do we need to come to a conclusion on? What do we need to reasonably decide? And oftentimes, poor arguments do these yes-no questions. It's usually not stated in your essay. When you write an argument, you're probably not going to state that here's our question. You're going to have a question you're going to answer. And if you think in terms of essay 3, I've already kind of done that for you. You have two options. Both of the options are questions. Now you will narrow the focus of your question, right? You're going to take one of those questions, narrow your focus to something specific, and you're going to answer that question. The way in which we ask that question is important, even if it's only in our heads. Because what you'll find in many conflicts is that people have two different questions in mind. You think about that for a second. If you talk about interpersonal relationships, if you talk about relationships between people at work, there's a lot of conflicts with people at work. Sometimes it's not because one person's bad and another person's good, but because you have different connections and different questions you want answered. And your answer is essentially your thesis. Okay? Now the problem, of course, is that it's not just a yes, no, either or. If you remember that Professor Morris does not like the 5-paragraph essay. And one of the reasons for that is that the 5-paragraph essay has a thesis, a claim, a main point that's being argued or presented. And the 5-paragraph essay gives only 3 reasons to support that, as if that's the way the world works. There are only 3 reasons to support this position, when in reality that's not the way argument is. And then you end up with these very generalized statements about generalized things that don't actually go anywhere. In many instances, your thesis is supported by other claims. You may have claims that you are making at the time that are like mini thesis statements supporting that first thesis statement. So your argument may be very complex. Okay? Your support is where your argument stands and falls. And this is where a lot of people get themselves in trouble. They have the sense that your argument stands and falls on the quality of your thesis, or actually the rightness of your thesis. If I believe my thesis is true, then I already have a good argument. And that is not true. I want my students, when they learn argument in any class I teach on it, they need to understand that while you should have a good thesis, something you can argue, that you can defend, your argument does not stand and fall on that. 101. You can, just because you are right does not mean you've proven yourself right. You have not proven this to be correct. You have to support the thesis. Connie Missimer, in her book, Good Arguments, it's a really fine book, talks about what support is. And she uses a metaphor of a house. Okay? That your thesis is kind of your roof, and your support are the walls to your house. You know, you can have a kind of crappy wall, and it's going to make your argument a little weaker, right? If you have lots of crappy walls, your ceiling is on the floor. And it doesn't matter how right it is. So you have to support your position fairly well. Okay? And we support our position in a lot of ways. We may find expert testimony, that is, people who have studied the subject for us, ahead of us, know much more about it than we do. We may find specific, supportable facts, things that we can verify that are true or not true. So we use that to support it. We don't just use opinions. And when we talk about research here in a minute, that becomes part of the problem for people, because they figure their job is to find 5 guys that agree with them. And that's not what research is. We can always find 5 guys that agree with us. If we have 5 friends, we can probably find somebody we can manipulate into agreeing with us. But we support our position with a lot of different things. And that most of those things are much more detailed in your book, so I don't want to go into it in huge detail. Do you have any questions about this? I've been talking a lot, talking really, really fast. Any questions? Okay. All right. No, Mr. Morris, this is the most fascinating, riveting lecture I've ever heard in my life. Okay. Let's talk about another element of let's see if the buttons will push. There we go. Are any of you taking speech or have taken speech in that class? Oh my gosh, lots of you. Good. So this should not be foreign to you. When you give a speech, you have appeals, right? You appeal to your audience in particular ways. When you do that in a speech, it's talking. The way you talk, the language you use, the material you use to support what you're saying, no matter what kind of speech it is. And the same is true in writing, particularly in argument. These are things that are rarely stated, but they are an essential part of who you are as an arguer and what you do and how. This gets back to the how, right? How you argue. we have an ethical appeal. This is not where you tell your reader, I'm a trustworthy person. You know that politicians always do that? They always try to portray themselves as trustworthy. So you figure, oh, he must be trustworthy. He looks trustworthy. How does somebody look trustworthy? Right? Of course I'm ethical. Or they say, I've seen everything. Well, it's not what you say, it's what you do. And how you put together your argument, how you support what you say, tells your reader that you've looked at all sides of the issue, the question, carefully. You've really looked at it. You haven't just looked at your position, you've looked at lots of positions. I used to give my students in a different course an assignment. It was a 2-part research paper. And then the second part was traditional research paper. But the first part, they had to do research on the 2 major positions on whatever topic they were writing about. Okay? And the goal was to get the research that showed what 2 sides said and what they believed, but you were also to not reveal what side you were on. That was the hard part. And I almost always knew. Almost always I could guess. It was a little game. Part of my response to them was, I'll bet you're going to take this position. And here's how I know. How do you not figure I knew what side they were on if they weren't supposed to tell me?
Because they would write in more detail about what they were writing about.
Very good. Yeah, excellent. They would write in much more detail. Absolutely.
Their choice of words and diction.
You're absolutely right. Give me an example.
Like the adjective they might use might be more flattering to their.
Flattering to
side.
one,
Yeah. And
not so flattering to another. Very good. Both good points. But
Like you said before, like they might write something that they actually really deeply, I don't know, you know, like it's something that they want, something that actually they believe in. You know, like you said before, they have emotion attached to.
Yeah.
So it's actually easy to know what.
And the emotional part comes when they're talking about what they feel, and when they talk about the other side, their emotions look different. Very good, excellent point. So you've got a lot of good reasons I could figure it out, and you're absolutely right. And bias is not a bad thing. We all are biased about certain things. But when we demonstrate that our bias has already told us how we feel, or tell us what our argument's going to be, that's a problem. Think about it. Think about it in terms of the curfew argument, right? If when you were having that argument, or if you're an adult arguing with your teenagers or somebody else, have you ever kept information from your parents about a friend? I'm going out with so-and-so. Here's why you should think that so-and-so is a really good person for me to hang out with. They're in National Honor Society. They have a 3.5 grade point average. They've got this, they've got that. They volunteer at the pet shelter, whatever. They do all these nice things so that they look good, right? But you don't tell them, oh, and by the way, he's really good at procuring alcohol for the gang. He's really good at, he has like 3 girlfriends and he's gotten 2 of them pregnant. You know, we leave that information out, right? We don't tell parents that. Well, if you leave information out, then you are not being honest about all sides. So that becomes a problem. Emotional appeal is not where you tell people how to feel, or where you use emotional language to get people on your side. And a lot of arguments do this. They rely so much, and if you look at the material in the book on logical fallacies, you'll see that many of them are appeals to emotion. But that's not what I'm talking about. If you already feel strongly about a subject, it's pretty easy for you to write about that subject. In terms of writing words, doesn't mean writing well. Okay? An emotional appeal works differently. Because has anyone heard the phrase preaching to the choir? What does that mean? What does the phrase preaching to the choir mean?
You understand that?
You understand them, okay?
Speaking
What'd you say?
Large group, speaking to a large group.
A particular large group, though.
people who you agree or who agree with you.
Very good. And why do they agree with you? How do you know they agree with you?
Because you know them, or well, y'all, that's a
Well, they're in
common
the same
topic,
pla-
y'all.
Okay, very good. So if there's a minister in church, think of it this way. Minister has to give a sermon every week, right? So the minister says, this is what's right. Who is in the congregation, particularly the choir, who's already not just members of the church, but vested members of the church, who are doing something at church? How likely are the people in the choir to agree with him? Very, very likely. Now, it doesn't mean that that's bad, by the way, but the problem is when we don't have the right emotional appeal, we're preaching to the choir. Whenever you had an argument with, for example, with your parents over a curfew, and I'm sure one of two of you had that argument, did any of your friends listen to you? You go to your friends afterwards. I always did. I'd sit there and complain and tell my friends, my parents are so mean and they won't let me do this, and that we'd all trade horror stories. My parents are this and my parents are this. And I'd always have one friend who said, well, I told my mom where to go and I did whatever the hell I wanted to do. Uh-huh. Any of your friends ever say, you know what, they feed you, they clothe you, they take care of you, shut up and do what they say? Any of your friends do that? Really? A lot of them? But would you consider that person a better friend? Why?
Because they're telling me the correct thing to do and not just going along with me.
They're caring about you enough to see the bigger picture, take that risk, right? That's very good. That's very, very good. But most of us, we're still mad at our parents, so we're going to say the same thing. And guess what? Parents do the same thing. I don't know if you noticed this. I watched my wife do it when my oldest was a teenager. She'd get on the phone with her mom, get on the phone with one of her friends, and I would hear them yammering to each other about how ungrateful and awful their kids were. So we all do it, right? But I want you to think in another way. Have you ever been excited about something you really, really loved, or something you were really, really angry about, but no one felt the same way? Not just that they didn't feel the exact same way, they didn't care. They see you as excited about something. Now, we may have that feeling, say, when we fall in love with someone. But say you suddenly get interested in a particular topic or something a particular musician or artist or something, and you really love it, so you can't stop talking about it, but nobody else cares. Everybody else is going, shut up, leave it. Your emotional appeal is you convincing those people that this is worth looking at. It's not just something I'm excited about. You should pay attention to it. Now, logical appeal is where you are logical. No, not just logical. You can't just say, I'm a logical person. This is a logical argument. I hate it when somebody tells me that the argument that they have just given me is logical. And I really hate it when the student writes, it's common sense. I hate to see that. Don't do that. Because if you write an essay and you have to tell me that the points you're making are common sense, you've wasted our time. If it's common sense, there's no reason to write a paper about it. Right? So logical appeal is not saying it's common sense, but demonstrating that all those things go together. That your thesis and all the things that you use to support your thesis go together logically. That there is a clear connection between an example that you use to demonstrate a point and the point itself. That that the research you've done has not been taken out of context or made up or has a significantly biased focus that is not going to be fair. Okay? So your appeal has to work that way. Any questions? No, Mr. Morris, go to the next slide, please. I'm so excited. Okay. Now we're going to move from argument to research. Argument's all sorts of fun when we're sitting around with beer and we're talking about things we sort of care about. Right? But it's another story when you have to do research. And I want you to think of research not in terms of, as I said before, 5 guys that 5 guys who agree with us, but we're trying to find material that supports us. So we want what we call an informed argument. That's our goal. We want an informed argument. And of course, when you listen to a friend argue a point, you're much more likely to believe them if they have information, not just opinions, but information that supports them, right? Now that's pretty easy. I will tell you, one of the reasons I have this up here about procrastination is that it's what gets people in trouble. I told you last week, I mentioned that 10% more students drop 1302 than 1301. And one of the reasons is because they all want to drop right when the big research papers do. Why? Well, because all the other essays, they may have 2 or 3 weeks or a month to work on them, but they blow it off, they throw it together at the last second, they manage to pass, success breeds success, false success breeds false success, right? But then when they realize, oh my gosh, I have a day and a half to pull 10 pages together, and I can't get out of going to the library. I actually have to go. I actually have to do research. Then they realize this can't be done. And that's when many students drop. If writing is stressful, and it causes stress, even to professional writers, then procrastinating in your research causes you even more. Okay? Gives you less time to make good choices. And that's one of the most important things. Because I tell students all the time that a lot of times a research project stands and falls not necessarily on how right or wrong you are, or even how much evidence you find, but on the choices you make in your research. If you make poor choices, then your project is not going to come out very well. If you have this much time to make choices as opposed to this much time, you have this much time, you have time to make mistakes and learn from them. You have this much time, you don't have any time. Okay? Think about it this way. Any project you have has roadblocks. Any essay you write, anything, everything you do has a roadblock, things that will get in the way. Murphy's Law, right? Whatever can go wrong will go wrong. So if you are planning your project, then the equivalent of this is the day you set aside to go to the library and find some books, or the day you set aside to go to the link and get help with your revision, that's the day that your car breaks down. That's the day that you get called into work suddenly, or your kid gets sick, or a friend needs you for something really, really important. Away from that. And I don't like to really use battle war metaphors, but it's kind of appropriate when we think about research. You have to plan what you're going to do. And that doesn't mean having this giant scheme of things. Everybody plans a different way. But before you start, you have to know what you don't know. What do I not know about this topic? You also have to understand the parameters of the project. That's essentially the expectations. What does my professor expect from me? Right? And it's not just, I need this many pages, I have to have this kind of sources, although that is a part of it. That is certainly part of those expectations. But there are other things as well. You may have, if you have to do a research project at work, your boss may say, okay, I'm thinking about buying this product, just do some research and give me a report in a week. And you say, okay, this is easy, I'll just Google that sucker. Uh-oh, broke it. I'll just Google that sucker and I'll have the information I need in a minute. And that may work. But other times your boss may ask for more specific information. Your boss may, for example, not want just the price of the product, but may want things like information about technical support, say if it's software. Your boss may want something about the company itself, You know, what kind of company is it? Do they have a good track record? Do they may want testimony from other people who've purchased their products. They may want all sorts of other things. A company, for example, may ask for a fiscal report. They want to know what kind of is this company in good shape money-wise? And you might say, well, why is that? Why do you care how much money they have? Well, the boss may think, well, last time I bought software, I bought a really good software at a really good price, and everything was fine for 3 months, and then the company went bankrupt. And then I didn't have any technical support. So you got to figure out what the parameters are. It also helps to see how these fit in the course. I have a colleague in government, and he said that one of the funniest things that happens is that students will have this major project to do, and they have all semester to do it. And every time it's due, half the class comes in looking like they have been up for 3 days straight. And half the class comes in all rosy and cheerful. And they're usually talking about how hard the project was as they start. And usually somebody that is rosy and cheerful says, or somebody who's not rosy and cheerful, rather, will say, I just couldn't find anything to write about. And I couldn't find information on that topic. And I couldn't find, and I couldn't do this. And somebody that was the rosy, cheerful people will oftentimes say, oh, but that was talked about in chapter 4 of the book. Oh, well, I haven't been reading the textbook. Okay? Or he explained all those things, all those potential topics on page 3 of the syllabus. Oh, well, I didn't read the syllabus. See, if you see how it fits in your course, you'll save yourself a lot of trouble. Having a schedule helps you to handle each part so that when something goes wrong, you can make changes. You can make choices that fix that. So the day you set aside to go to the library, you don't get to go. If that's early enough in your schedule, you can change. Okay? It's also important to ask questions. I have students ask questions about research projects all the time the day the paper's due. And they're the kind of questions that are very good questions, but they would have been better questions 2 weeks prior. When you get information, that's what research is. It's not finding facts, but I have a lot of suggestions for it. One of them is to get more than you need. Back when I was a student, teachers did what they do now. They'll say, okay, I want you to get this many sources. And let's say the professor says, I want you to get 5 sources. And of course, we didn't have the internet back then because we wrote our dinosaurs to work and to class. So we would all ride our dinosaurs to the library. We'd hop off. We'd go in. And the professor says, I want 5 sources. So we'd go find 5 books that were on that topic or 5 articles. We would take them home, we'd stick them in a bag, and a couple of days before the paper was due, we'd pull them out. And the problem would be, of course, that 4 of those things had nothing to do with our topic. So what do you think happened? Panic, insanity ensues. So you end up doing all this scrambling at the last second. The more research you have, the easier it is to determine what's the best stuff for you. And sometimes you don't know when it is. Has to do with a working bibliography. And we'll talk about that in a moment. This is where you keep up with your research. It is one of the things I just hammer and hammer and hammer to my students, and so few of them do it. And then I get that parental, I told you so. Use your research to develop your thesis. You may have an idea of what you want to say, but a lot of times students believe they have to have their whole thesis, their whole argument fully formed when they walk into the library or they log on to the library website to use the databases. They think they've got to have it all figured out and then find people who are saying the same thing. No. Sometimes you need to get information in order to figure out what it is you want to argue. A few years ago, I asked my students to write a paper on a variety of environmental topics. And one of the things that was really interesting about that project was that most of my students had no knowledge of anything related to the environment. So, they'd seen commercials about recycling, and they'd heard people talk about climate change and various things like that, but they had no opinion one way or the other. This is neither bad nor good. It just is. But what was fun about that was watching people developed their own positions. They didn't always come to the same conclusions, but they developed their positions as they learned more about their topic. You need to understand the value of a timely source. If something's out of date, it hurts your credibility. An argument is bad if you don't have credibility. It doesn't matter how right you are. You know, if you've lied to your parents 100 times, the one time you're telling the truth, they're not going to believe you. Over time, as a student, you develop a skill called discernment. And actually, as a human being, we do this all the time. We pick our friends. This is how we date. If the first person you ever had a little crush on, you fell in love with, and you stayed with that person for the rest of your life, and you got married, and everything was both hunky and dory, God bless you, I'd like to hear your story. But most of us don't. If that were true, I would right now be married to a little girl named Cicely that I had a crush on in the 2nd grade. Oh, Cicely. She was very cute, very adorable. I have no idea what happened to Cicely. She may be a nun. She may be a dude by now. I don't know. Who could tell? But one of the reasons we date is because, and you don't know this till later in life, one of the reasons we date is to figure out who we want to be with. We don't just have a little set, okay, I want to be with this, 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 and this. We also kind of amend those as we go along. You know, I really wanted a good-looking spouse, but I dated 3 or 4 good-looking people, and not all of them were nice people. Some of them were nice, but they were nice in different ways. And maybe maybe this good-looking thing should not be my top priority. Maybe something else should be important to me. And as we grow as human beings, things become important to us, right? I know as a 16-year-old boy, for example, religion meant nothing to me. Anybody who was willing to hold my hand and kiss me, I like you. But as I got older, that became more important to me. Not because they had to share every single religious value I had, but I wanted someone for whom that was important, if that makes some sense. And if you may be the opposite. You may want someone who's completely non-religious. You may want somebody who's different. And what does that mean? Well, we discern as we grow and as we learn. In research, we do the same thing. As we start to weigh sources, as we start to figure out, well, you know, I kind of been agreeing with these people, but they're kind of mean. Maybe they're not always on the right track. Or things that we disagreed with or didn't like before, we start to realize, hey, they may have 1 or 2 good things to say. So when we develop that over time, we become better thinkers and we become better writers because we do a whole lot of discernment. And sometimes it's good to use an unusual source. Sometimes you have parameters for certain things, and sometimes you can add other things. A few years ago, before I was a teacher, I had to write a report about an employee that wasn't a very good employee. And my boss wanted to find reasons, essentially, to see whether or not this person should be fired. My boss wanted to fire him, but fearing legal action, wanted some documentation. So I had to write this report. So I go and look at all these performance reviews. And I know this guy's a schmuck. I know he's a jerk. I know he's a terrible employee, but all his performance reviews are great. So I said, can I do something outside your parameters? And I went and interviewed all his bosses. I found out he was moving from department to department. His bosses were all saying nice things about him, but they hated him. And I found out, well, they were scared of him. So that I could use that in my report. And until I kind of went outside the box a little bit, I didn't realize that that was possible. You know, toe the line, do what you're told. Any questions about this? A working bibliography is, in some sense, a list of all the sources that are potential to your paper. That is, something that you might use. If you are doing research well, you're probably going to have 3 piles of information. You'll find some sources that you like, and as soon as you see them, you've read them, read the first few pages or whatever of it, and there's all sorts of good data, information that you know you can use. I don't know where it's going in my paper, but I got to use this source. And that goes in your yes pile, right? And then you look at some other sources, and it doesn't take you long to realize this is not on my topic, or this is an over-biased source, there's a real serious problem here, or there's something that isn't going to work. And so you tell yourself, that's a no. I'm not going to use that source. The problem is, if we do our research well, and it's just a big mess of chaos until we finish our paper, the biggest side is the one in the middle, the maybe. And your working bibliography is, in a sense, everything in the yes and the maybe columns, not just the yes. Now, when you do your approval assignment for this essay, I'm telling you ahead of time, when you do your approval assignment, I'm going to ask for a working bibliography. And I can guarantee you that a lot of people are going to give me nothing but their yes pile. And I can also guarantee you that many students are going to have both a yes and a maybe pile, but it's in their head. And they're going to spend the entire period redoing the same research. Let me repeat that. They will redo the research. Why? Because they didn't write it down. They didn't write down the sources that they might use in the paper. And there are a lot of good reasons to do this, other than the fact that Professor Morse is going to ask for it, so you might as well compile it now while you're doing the research. One reason is it's hard to tell whether something's valuable or useful until you start writing. You may plan your essay out and you have a section here that talks about a particular part, and then when you get to that you go, I know I ran into some article somewhere that had to do with this one thing. What was it? You have information on a bibliography, it's a lot easier to go back and find it. Because if you only have to have one source or two sources, it's easy to keep those things straight in your brain. It's not when you have to do a lot. It's also easier to make your works cited page because when you get to the final paper, all you have to do is copy over the ones that you did actually use in your paper. It's also useful for further research. One of the things I learned, I didn't learn this till graduate school because I'm not as smart as you guys, is that because I was studying some of the same things in graduate school, I started to find the same books, the same articles, over and over and over. Well, while you're working on your major, the thing that you really are going to college to study, and you start finding the same books, the same websites, the same articles, you probably should have a list of those because it's going to make your research in those courses a lot easier. Now, if you're putting together a working bibliography, you want to try to write those things down in the format that you are expected to use for that course. In English, it's MLA. And next week, when I talk to you about online databases, I'll show you that many of the databases will already put that information in MLA format for you. So it saves you a lot of trouble, okay? You also have a book with lots of examples, chapter 10, which you've already read, which if you haven't read, you'll have read by, say, Thursday at 9:30. If you don't know why, feel free to look at the calendar. But it will help you you have that to use as a guide, okay? You also should write summaries of things that you've done. And I'm going to tell you that's one of the other things I'm going to ask for on that approval assignment. 1 sentence, 2 sentences. This article is about such and such. I will use it in my paper this way, or I might use it for this. All those things are triggers to your memory. When you go to pull your paper together, it's going to make your life a lot easier. Okay? Questions? Concerns? No, Mr. Morris, I want to go home. I know that it doesn't feel this way when you do a research project, because what you really want is just get it over with, get a decent job, do a decent job, get a decent grade. However, when you do this, you should get a lot more out of it than a headache and a grade. You should get something more. And what happens is, of course, one of the reasons students don't pull the process together, the messy part, they don't do the messy part just like they don't do pre-writing, they don't do revision, is because they know that the teacher doesn't see that. The teacher doesn't see the wadded up pieces of paper on the ground. Teacher doesn't see all the articles you read but didn't use in your essay. But I can guarantee you the teacher sees the quality of your work and the final product. Now, any questions?